So let me take this opportunity to welcome everyone who is participating in this webinar to this book launch. It's one of several events in this very important field, and the book that has just been published is of course available to everyone. And I'm very pleased to welcome you on behalf of the International Development Evaluation Association, IDEAS, because IDEAS was established 18 years ago in Beijing in China. It consists of hundreds of people working on evaluation in the context of development worldwide. We work across sectors, across countries, across ideologies. There is a strong focus on the global south. And there are many areas of interest with some interest groups operating in areas, climate change and environment, violent and fragile contexts, young emerging evaluators, gender transformation, which is a recent and very strong focus, working on producing outputs, competency and other frameworks, guidance in evaluation. We meet every 2 years somewhere in the world as a global assembly, and books come out of these meetings too. So you may want to have a look on the internet. It's available both in Amazon and online. The most recent one is called Evaluation for Transformational Change in the context of the SDGs. So you may want to have a look at that. And those of you who may be interested, please do take time and see if you would like to join us as part of this community, international community of evaluation specialists working in development. And we are entering an exciting new phase with our new president, Ada Ocampo from Peru, who is joining us from January onwards. So that's about IDEAS. And again, I welcome you on behalf of the association. But let's get down to a very few technical matters that I want to discuss quickly. We have nearly 500 persons who registered, and although not all will be online, many will listen to us afterwards. We will make a recording available on several sites. We also hope that we will be able to answer as many of your questions in person as possible. We use the question and answer, the Q&A function, so there won't be a live chat that runs on the side because there may be many questions. We use this webinar function. It means that if you have a comment or a question, please put it, click on Q&A, please type it, the panel will see it, and we will try to respond as well as we can, either in writing, which will be responding to you personally, but ideally we will respond live. Those questions that we will not be able to respond to in this webinar, we will be able to, or we hope, we will be able to cover afterwards. Some of the panelists have agreed to take time to respond in writing, and we can then make it available to all those who have registered and participated as well. So I trust that will work for all of you. Please let us know if you have any challenge by typing into the Q&A box. And Lana and Daniel, who are the IDEAS Secretariat, will be able to respond to any technical or other information that you may require. And we will also do some polls. I think we already have done one. So Lana, would you, do you have the results of the poll for us? Can you show that to us?
Yes, sure. So now you can see this.
So you can see there's an overwhelming perception that RCTs can be relevant, but not always. Depends on the question and the context. And some believe they should generally be avoided. And then 1% who says we should always prefer. We may repeat this question towards the end if there is time. And we will also do 2 more questions. This one was rather easy. Let's see if the other two will be similarly easy. We will get to them very shortly. Lana, you want to close? You want to close the results of this one?
Yes, it's closed now.
So with that in mind, maybe what we can do is, Lana, let's quickly look at the second and the third poll as well. Let's do the polls because maybe some of our panel may want to talk to those, and then we'll go into the session. So 1 minute for each of the polls. Let's see, please respond to this one as you did to the other one. Can you share the results then? Can everybody see the results, Lana? Yeah, I guess so.
Yes, now yes.
Yeah, and so we can see that 48% say between 20 to 50%. And then some say very little, 28%. And then, of course, quite a lot, 21%. And some believe all interventions can be measured by RCTs. I wish there was time to discuss the results, but as I said, some of the panelists may want to speak to this. I know the conventional response to this, and it would be nice to discuss some of this as panelists. All right, can we have the last one, Lana, please? Mm-hmm. And just as explanation, there have been other events for the launch of the book with other audiences, and some of the panelists have the results of that in mind. And again, they will perhaps make a comparison between this audience and what they've experienced before. So we can end the polling and you can share the results, Lana. You see, this is interesting. It's very relevant for us now. And one can see the majority says no, but quite a good number of people believe that it can make a difference at this time. And certainly with the challenge that we face of poverty. Good. Let's keep that. Thank you very much, Lana. So let's keep this in the back of our mind when we have our discussions and also when you formulate your questions. I would like to just lead in our panelists with the following very few comments. We are in the era of the Anthropocene, as you know, and we're facing several crises beyond COVID-19 pandemic. We face an economic recession or even depression as a result. We face the pandemic of inequality, social injustice, and efforts to increase the divide between people in the world. We face the crisis of climate breakdown and of biodiversity destruction. This means that evaluation has to be the best it can be for this time. It's not an intellectual exercise. It touches people everywhere, especially those who are most vulnerable to these crises. And I'm always reminded of a good friend and colleague of mine from Mauritania, who used to be an African Evaluation Association president as well. And she said at one stage in a heated exchange with one of the financiers of evaluations, she said, it's not about your project, it's about my country. And that is something that has stayed with me over the last decade, because it is very important that we all keep that in mind as we learn from one another in order to tap the potential of evaluation for this time. And I therefore appreciate very much that the editors and the authors of this book did exactly that. They bridged many divides in terms of fields of work and disciplines, ideologies, ways of thinking about RCTs, to bridge disciplinary and to bring people together in this book in order to try to bring a synthesis of what we know up to this point, given the many controversies surrounding this methodology. Now, I didn't introduce myself. I'm Zenda Ophir. You have the bios in the original invitation. We felt that time is so valuable, we will not go into the detail of bios this time. I'm South African. I'm Vice President of Ideas in this capacity and an independent evaluation specialist currently based in Geneva, but originally from beautiful Cape Town, and that is still my home. I work around the world, and I am very grateful that I work in development and both from global to local level. I'd like to introduce the editors of the book. They will be our first contributors. It's my pleasure to introduce to you Francois Rubow, who is a Senior Research Fellow, French National Research Institute for Sustainable Development. He's responsible for several innovations in statistics. He serves as serve as international standards widely used in low-income countries. He works as a development economist in areas such as the informal economy, corruption, and institutions, and much more. You can read his bio in the invitation. And Isabelle Guerin, who is a socioeconomist, a senior research fellow at the French National Research Institute for Sustainable Development. She's widely published, specializes in the political and moral economics of money, debt, and finance. Combines academia and practice, integrating disciplines. And she says she keeps on thinking of conditions of data production and combination of methods. And the third editor, Florent Bedecarat, could not be with us today. He's with us in spirit. But Francois and Isabelle will make us the first presentation divided between themselves. They will do for 10 to 15 minutes because they will lay out for us the book. They also have a chapter in it on microfinance in development, whether it's a miracle or a mirage. And I just want to mention that our very honored ideas evaluation, in a way, almost father of ideas, Bob Picciotto, was one of the key authors of a chapter on our randomistas evaluators. And although he cannot be with us because he's in New Zealand, it's now middle of the night, we appreciate also his contribution with an ideas hat on. So with those words, Francois, Isabelle, I hope I can hand over to you. You want to share your screens, and over to you to introduce us to this interesting book.
Thank you, Zenda, for the presentation. Hi, everybody, panelists and the audience. Thanks for Ideas for inviting us. And also to Robert Picciotto, as you mentioned, who had the idea of presenting this book in the community of evaluators. So I will present with Isabelle the book, an introduction to the book. For my part, I will say a word on the making of the book, and Isabelle will focus on the main takeaways and will keep in mind this idea of the COVID. So the book is the result of a long process, nearly a decade, which began with the three of us mentioned by Zenda, Florent and Isabelle, with this RCT exponential rise of the so-called gold standard since the beginning of the 2000s, and with an intriguing question: what is a revolution, as claimed by the randomista, or just a fashion which should fade someday? And so we launched by ourselves a research project with two main research questions. The first one was what are the methodological properties of RCTs? Are they the holy grail, as claimed? And the second is the why, the road to the global success, the famous stairway to heaven. We finished in 2007 with the first set of results, trying to investigate three main lines. The first one, classical, theoretical critiques, RCTs in theory, the question of internal and external validity. We are not specially qualified, and many other important economists and others have insight about this. And more original, we investigate the empirical critiques on RCTs in practice and how experiments are conducted in the field. And at last, a third dimension, also original, apart from these two previous, is the political economy of what we call the scientific business of the pro-RCT movement. So doing the math, doing the cooking, and doing the accounts. What are the conclusions we draw from this exercise? Mainly three sets of conclusions. The first one is that RCTs are a sound tool to assess causal impact, but, and I think that it's basically in line with the results of the poll today, the but are, it's limited to a set of possibility, a yes, no answer, and quantifying how much, but nothing on the why and on the channels, which mean a real question for the theory of causation. And the second condition is that if they are conducted by the book and under certain conditions, which are really rarely met in the real world, and because there's no virgin field in the global south. Three of the randomistas' claims are illegitimate. The first one is RCT is only rigorous or scientific method in town. The second, that RCT can explain all what works and what doesn't in development. And the third claim is that multiplying RCTs on all topics and tropics will overcome the external validity issue, what we call the hegemonical project. And at least on the political economy side, we try to investigate the strategy of market domination by the pro-RCT movement with this idea of building a monopoly and capture the rents in the impact evaluation field. The phase two, we began 3 years ago. We have two parallel tracks. The first one is, after the general consideration, to try to investigate in depth one sector, which is RCTs on microcredit, and more especially a special issue of the American Economic Journal, Applied Economics, published in 2015, which was considered by some as the last word on microcredits. And the result of this investigation is one of the chapters of the book. And then from the top, a collective book we are discussing today called Randomized Control Trial in Development, a Critical Perspective. So to end up my first flavor of the book, let's have a look at the outline of the book. We can divide this in different parts. First, at the extremes, the chapters, preface and epilogue by two Nobel Prize, Angus Deaton and James Heckman, present today, which are with insightful ideas, but at the same time, a shield for us as commoners in the world of Nobel Prize winners. Then a first block of an overview of the potential of RCTs with 4 chapters, basically 2 on the con size, even if the balance is already here. Martin Ravalion and Lant, who will present his own view, and 2 from the pro side, Jonathan Murdoch and Timothy Ogden. Then we've got a block of 3 chapters on sectoral views and in-depth thorough investigation, global health, sanitation, and microcredit, our chapter. 2 chapters on the political economy side of RCTs, with one on the rhetoric, trying to link poor economics discourse on the economic side and the method, technical method, and the other one by Bob Picciotto about a randomista in the global context of evaluator. A last block on what can be done to improve these matters, with the question of ethics by Ariane. She will speak about a chapter. And then two contributions by a well-known statistician, among which Professor Ekman, about using priors or compliance characteristic to try to improve the potential. And at the last but not the least, there is this interview part at the end of the book with policymakers from the north, from France, and also from the south, high-ranking officer of the Indian governments, which give their view on the role of RCT in real world of policy making in India, which is supposed to be the main field of application of Randomized. So that's for my part, and now I give the floor to Isabelle for the takeaway of our book.
Yeah, let me share my screen. 1 second. It's coming. Yeah. So good evening, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are, and thank you so much to IDs for this great opportunity. Well, I'm not going to summarize the book. This is simply impossible given the diversity and richness of the contribution. Let me just highlight a few points. The initial idea behind the book was to better define the scope of application of RCT. Well, very simply, what are the questions they can answer? What are the questions they cannot answer? And to be able to do so, we have established a dialogue between different disciplines, between scholars and policymakers, and also between different visions regarding the scope of RCTs. And the introduction of the volume, which reflects only the standpoint of the editors, draws our own lessons of this dialogue. And in fact, it is an attempt to answer the following question. Ultimately, what opposes the advocates of RCT and its critics? What are the areas of disagreement? Or to put it differently, what are the terms of the debate? And here we have 3 points which are clearly articulated: epistemology, politics, and ethics. And coming back to the poll that we had at the start of the webinar, I'm not going to give any answer. I'm just going to clarify where do the diverging, conflicting answers come from. So let me start with the issue of epistemology. With here a certain form of positivism, even sometimes scientism, against what could be called pragmatism. Are we looking for universal answers, or are we looking for reasonable explanations, limited in time, in space, and attentive to the diversity of situations, including within specific groups? As many of you probably know, the claim of randomistas to universality has already been strongly criticized because of their inability, in many cases, to demonstrate external validity. What is true in a specific context might not apply elsewhere. The limits of the average result has also been widely discussed and criticized. RCT focus on the average results, while in many cases, what matters for practitioners and decision makers is the heterogeneity of the results, who gains and who loses and from a particular intervention. Something which has been less discussed, and also in line with the previous work that we've done, is the gap between the protocol in theory and the protocol in practice. And here the question is, should we focus primarily on a theoretical protocol able of measuring causality and statistical inference, or are we concerned about the feasibility of the protocol, the way it is implemented in the ground, in the real world? In many cases, field constraints contradict the assumption of the statistical theorems used for inference. And here deviations between protocol and implementation can be observed all the way down the knowledge production line. Sampling and at the level of the intervention, which in some cases is artificially transformed to meet the requirement of the protocol. At the level of data collection, at the level of the interpretation of the results. In theory, the result is a simple comparison of averages. In practice, the interpretation of the result involves multiple hypotheses, and even in some cases, an art of rhetoric that proved to be extremely persuasive. And the requirements of the theoretical protocol have a critical implication for the type of intervention RCTs can study and the type of questions they can answer. This brings us to the political question. In short, do we consider development and the fight against poverty as an aggregation of private goods and micro-interventions? Or is development first and foremost seen as a matter of transformative politics, infrastructure, and institutions? And here, regardless of the worldview of the randomistas, the technical constraints of RCT force them to focus on micro-interventions and private goods. I will say no more here. This is a key argument of Len Pritchett. Just one word, because the book provides other very concrete examples in subfields. I mean, in the field of global health, do we look at financial incentives and mosquito nets, or do we look at complex and systemic health systems? Sanitation, do we look at the use of latrines, or do we look at the infrastructure of human waste flows? In the field of governance and public administrations, do we look at random inspections, or do we look at wake state capacity? Then, for the reasons mentioned earlier, deviations between official protocol and real protocol, the ability of RCTs to measure impact is in fact rather limited. And in fact, quite often, RCTs are rather used to compare different modalities of a specific intervention. For instance, agriculture fertilizer combined with training or without training. And then the RCT is going to measure the outcome in terms of intervention take-up. And this allows RCT randomista to test behaviors. If we change prices, timeframes, if we provide information, assistance, training, and different sorts of information, different sorts of assistance, how do people behave, and how does this affect the take-up, whether they use the intervention or not? And this is a crucial lesson. In many cases, RCTs are in fact better adapted to test behaviors rather than evaluating impact. Well, we can look at this in two ways. One is to consider that this allows for a better understanding of behaviors, given that in many cases, the results challenge misconception in development economics. For example, in the field of microcredit, RCTs have shown that contrary to a widespread belief, the poor are sensitive to price. One can also look at this in another way and consider that ultimately, those kind of RCTs are similar to social marketing. By this, I mean how to better distribute or sell a product, a microcredit, a water filter, and so forth, which we believe has a positive social impact, but in fact, in many cases, we still don't know. Well, if you consider development as an aggregation of micro-interventions, this is fine, but the impact issue remains unanswered. But if you consider development as transformative politics, this is more problematic. The third point of debate has to do with ethics. I will not elaborate on this point, since it will be the focus of Ariane Saffard's talk. Just one word: do we advance science or do we protect the people? As a way of conclusion, I don't have the time to elaborate, but we can come back to this in the discussion. I would just say that the response of RCT in the development field to the current pandemic crisis largely confirm our observation. But I suggest to stop here so that we have more time for our authors and for the discussion, and we come back to this. We can come back to this in the discussion. Thank you.
Thanks very much to you both. That was a really very interesting introduction to the issues covered and the type of topics. We already have a few questions, and I'm just going to pose very quickly two to you, because they will hopefully be very brief responses. So the first one is Linda Mora-Imas asks, why didn't you include evaluation as a discipline debating RCTs in your list? I wonder if that says anything about the practice or profession of evaluation.
Yes, so
yeah.
you like me to answer now? I mean, the answer will be very quick. I mean, yes. Yeah, of course. I mean, in the introduction, we elaborate on this, and there is a full chapter in the book by Bob Picciotto explaining in detail why. I mean, the evaluation field has done already a lot in terms of evaluation, and RCT promoters are simply ignoring all the lessons learned in this field, and ultimately RCTs are not evaluation. I mean, this is one of the conclusions of the book. Yeah.
Thank you. I hope we pick that up again a bit later. Let's also just a brief one is Soltang asked whether the book will speak about data contamination, which is also an issue. Is that something discussed?
Clearly, it's the object of the first line of research, and which is synthesized in our chapter in particular. It's about not only discussing econometrics, which is a specialty or one of the specialty even contested of the randomista, but looking at the statistical property in the field of the survey which has conducted. And we've got a full replication of one of the RCTs in Morocco on microcredit, which show a real mess on this problem of data contamination.
Thank you. So that is very good. I would like to move on. We're going to keep some of the questions, obviously, for the session afterwards, after the presentations. I would very much like to ask you, though, to keep on sending your questions, and we will either fit them in, but certainly try to cover them at the end. And thank you for those already doing that. I also saw, Fabiola, that you raised your hand. If you don't mind, would you mind typing your comment or question? Otherwise, because we are not going to take verbal ones, rather just typed ones, in order to be able to cover as many as possible. Thank you for doing that. So now it is my pleasure to introduce to you the first author that we are going to ask to make about a 10-minute presentation. And it's a real honor because of James Heckman's reputation and his achievements over many, many years. He's also one of the persons who has lived with various phases of randomized control trials, and he will talk to that, I'm sure. He's a Henry Schultz Distinguished Service Professor of Economics and Public Policy, Director of the Center for the Economics of Human Development at the University of Chicago. And of course, something that says it all is that he was a winner of the Sveriges Riksbank Prize in Economics, the Nobel, what we call the Nobel Prize in Economics. So obviously also a winner of multiple other awards with a very impressive track record. And he does have a chapter that's actually the epilogue, Randomization and Social Policy Evaluation Revisited. So I look forward very much, and I'm sure we all do, to your remarks from your experience as author of the book.
Okay, it's a little unusual for the epilogue to lead off the presentations, but I guess I will try to do it in reverse order or whatever. The one thing that occurred to me in preparing this talk and reading the papers in the book and participating was a sense of deja vu. And what I thought was the old statement, what goes around comes around. And I would add, and goes around and comes around again. Because what I can say is that we've seen many, many examples, not just in randomized trials and economics, but also in other fields. So I'm not going to have time to go into those. But let me just give you a very brief presentation about the history of experimentation and why that's relevant today. My chapter deals with this. It's an update of a chapter which was written some 30 years ago, really, almost 30 years ago. Well, it was 30 years ago, in response to a large uprising in labor economics and in social policy that was focusing on the randomized control trial as the, quote, gold standard for evaluating manpower training programs, health programs, and a lot. There was a huge activity that was started in the 1960s, and it was even mandated in part by research leading from the War on Poverty by Lyndon Johnson. And the idea of the Johnson War on Poverty campaign and the whole Office of Economic Opportunity was they wanted to evaluate a series of programs that were launched to fight poverty in the United States. And so as part of this, and a crucial part of it, there were experiments that were launched, again, by this very same Office of Economic Opportunity. In fact, the pioneer I was a graduate student at MIT who has somehow disappeared into anonymity, unfortunately. But nonetheless, there are two era I'd like to talk about, because they really represent what I think is a change in focus. And the emphasis in the first era, I think, is closer to what is actually being emphasized by many of the speakers and authors in this volume today. In the first era, there were really big questions. And the idea was, in particular, the question was, can we really understand social policy and get the parameters that will allow us to develop new policies and understand old policies? So the original focus in a lot of work was the negative income tax, which was designed to essentially supplement the income of the poor, to tax them as they earn more income, but to essentially give them incentives to come off welfare, but nonetheless give them a floor, a base floor of earnings. And there was a lot of controversy, and that required, in terms of economics, understanding income and substitution effects. And the fact is, the non-experimental literature was very vague. Glenn Kane, late Glenn Kane at University of Wisconsin, actually had a collection of essays showing how much controversy there was in the field. And so the original goal was very focused. Does a given policy to promote welfare of indigent people work, and what are the income substitution effects? This was all cast in terms of a well-posed economic model, and those economic models were part of a general policy planning program. And this was true in other fields. It wasn't just income tax. Dennis Eigner did this work in Southern California on the time of day pricing, and conducted a series of experiments which the power company cooperated in, providing different times of day in different neighborhoods, finding how that affected electricity usage. But always there were economic parameters, and the goal was to take an economic model and use it to project forward and answer bigger questions. Because it was known that any particular policy evaluated by randomized trials would essentially not really be the one that was going to be tried in the field. So the specificity that seems to inhere in today's discussion, I think, is no longer, was not there. People understood that you couldn't just generalize in this way, so-called external validity issue. So there was a detailed focus on these big questions. In the second era, which is the era, I think, of the RCT that you're talking about, the randomistas and so forth, and I've been to the World Bank a few times talking about some of these issues, there's been a tremendous focus on methodology. But this focus also is a result of a change in the focus in economics toward away from bigger questions and away from what we sometimes call structural estimation, namely estimating models that are interpretable to answer economic questions that have well-posed questions anyway, maybe not good answers, to a question about estimating some effect, but doing it in a methodologically clean way. And somewhere in all of this, the whole discussion from empirical economics changed from understanding parameters to estimating treatment effects, even though the effects weren't that well specified and the welfare consequences were even not part of the story. And the whole notion, if you want to put it in a regression context, and here I regret the absence of a slide. I should have a regression with Y on the left-hand side, X on the right-hand side, a treatment dummy, and an error term. And the whole question was that U was correlated with D, whatever U happened to be. And that became an obsession. So people became very interested in getting estimates that were free of that correlation, no matter what they answered, no matter what question it is. But there was also something deeper. And there was a methodological premise that crept into the field that still it still drives a lot of discussion today. It certainly motivates the RCT movement. And namely, an assumption-free way to understand economic policy, to answer these big questions. And that the only true way to get at causal parameters is by some kind of external variation. And that's just not true. If you look at science and you look at the way science is conducted and knowledge is discovered, the way knowledge is discovered is we eliminate alternative explanations. Eliminating alternative explanations, one way to do it is possibly with a randomized trial. There's a lot of other ways to do it as well. And so if you look at epidemiology literature from the 19th century, and even today, it's a question of finding out what other explanations could, now that's a demanding task, because it consists not only of your explanation, but consisting of what valid alternatives are. That was the benefit of a model, and that was what was always there. So the whole process of empirical economics, the RCTs fitting into this kind, what I consider to be a super bubble. You should write another book about the bubble inside empirical economics that uses the randomized control trial as the ideal, the so-called gold standard for empirical research, when in fact it's not. When in fact what is relevant is understanding and eliminating alternative explanations. And that can be by historical arguments, it could be done by different types of comparisons. As Angus Deaton in his chapter, he quotes John Stuart Mill, essentially to the effect of what I'm saying here, although states it slightly differently. So let me just review the issues. As the field unfolded, this is now the 1970s and 80s, there were a lot of issues that came out and that are relevant today, and I don't want to just repeat them since you know many of these, but there were issues that were actually arose in constructing experiments and putting them in practice. There was so-called randomization bias, that literally randomizing people into a program. I worked on a program in the United States on a job training program, which literally changed the program. That literally, in order to comply with certain requirements, the individuals offering the program changed the program that was being evaluated. So it was almost like a Heisenberg uncertainty principle was injected. You changed what you were evaluating. And then there were a number of other issues that arose, specifically multi-stage randomization and so forth. And more deeply, when we think about what we want to understand, the notion of the mean difference between two outcomes as being the final goal was a very, very limited goal. And for some reason has been enshrined in the minds, at least congressmen maybe can understand it. People who are not very well trained in statistics can understand it. So I understand the rhetorical appeal. I've seen this appeal in groups of people. Yes, here's an aspirin, you give somebody an aspirin, they have a headache, they don't have a headache, what could be simpler? But then you can ask questions, well, wait, you gave them the aspirin, and did they suffer side effects? So yeah, they didn't have a head, they didn't have a headache, but they had a blood clot instead or something of the sort. Or more generally, with cancer treatments, does this cure cancer? But what is the pain and suffering that goes with it? There were a number of criteria which have already been referred to, not just mean differences in final outcomes, subjective effects. What is the effect on the median voter, not the effect on average? What's the effect on the top? If we're really interested in redistribution, we should be interested in things like what percentage of people benefit and who are the beneficiaries within the distribution. And the literature, which is focusing on these mean differences as the gold standard, has ignored this or circumvented it in various ways. There's been the creation of the so-called quantile treatment effect, which is a complete Frankenstein of economic evaluation, which literally assumes that if you have a treated outcome and you have a control outcome, that your rank in the treated outcome is the same as the rank in the control outcome, which is crazy. And when it's tested in general models, is always found to be inconsistent. So what I would argue is that we literally, by changing the focus from a problem to a methodology, a lot is lost. And I think this is what's going on. But I would just conclude as well that the discussion we're having today and the discussion that we had some 30 years ago too, I should point out, has its counterpart in medicine. Medicine is always viewed as being the ideal. Here, the randomized control trial is what makes medicine. We're looking at COVID vaccine treatments now from RCTs. Okay, very good. But Ralph Horowitz and many others have launched a retreat from RCTs in medicine, pointing out how many questions are unanswered and how distorting it is of medical knowledge. So I think that when we look at the whole history, and I'm talking about the earlier history when a lot of this work on randomized controlled trials was abandoned. wasn't totally thrown out. It's a tool. Randomization is a tool. It's not an end in itself. And for the same reason, getting X free of the unobservable is also not a goal in itself. The goal always should be trying to answer a question. And the always, I think, good science, good economics is use the best available tools. So if randomization helps, that's fine. But you don't say, I can't answer it. And I mean, there is a whole literature that simply says, you know, if you don't form certain moments or don't randomize or don't do this or don't do that, you can't answer the question. And that's insane. That is just not a way knowledge advances. It may be the way it advances within limited fields, maybe international bank structures, maybe foundations. I always think that looking at these foundations, I remember telling in another context, there's some people at the Gates Foundation, they had this crazy plan. And I said, well, please, when you will go meet your head, remember Benjamin Franklin's old adage that a fool and his money are easily parted. So it's easily, when you think about it, there really are some cases here where this insistence on methodology, it sounds good. It sounds appealing. It has this kind of fervor of Joan of Arc, sort of, you know, speaking to the masses in France and galvanizing the people. But what's really relevant is, are you answering big questions? And I would argue that in many areas, and I give examples in my essay, that it has not been the case, not just in development, which I know somewhat, but also in a lot of areas, for example, in labor economics, on labor supply, marriage, fertility, many cases where the methods applied, a partial answer, some interest, but never the final answer. So I'll stop with that.
That was so interesting, and I'm very sure that that raises so many questions and issues and comments. And I want to thank you for very, very insightful comments. I would like at this point, before we give the next person a chance to speak, I'd like to try to cluster 1 or 2 or 3 of the questions that we've received and one of my own together and ask you particularly, but also the 2 editors to quickly respond to the following issue. Some of the questions say, well, how are the issues that you raised, that was especially when the book's outline was presented, with RCTs not also present in most other available methodologies? What are you proposing be put in their place to simultaneously achieve causal identification and to solve the issues you are raising? This conversation feels like a reductive view of RCTs, reminiscent of the same debate we were having 10 years ago. No so-called randomista would use the term gold standard or suggest using the tool widely. Why is micro work and systemic change mutually exclusive? Why can't qualitative work and implementation research as components of RCTs not complement impact estimates? And I want to add to that, it raises an issue that does come up frequently in this type of discussion. And so Simone Ginsberg asked whether people, the so-called randomistas, are answering to the methodological and ethical critiques put forward. Is there a playing field for scientific confrontation, and to what extent did the book speak to these very different perspectives on the value of RCTs? One could call the book balanced, could one call the book balanced and authoritative? I would like any of you to respond to any of this, which I think is obviously very relevant points put forward.
Let me just, I will respond because I was brought in, but I won't.
Yes.
I think the editor should really be the respondents to this. I would just say that, as I was saying in my previous remark, that if we want to think, the goal, I don't think, is to say there is a particular methodology. I think we can change this whole discussion and say RCT versus this. It's not a question of this versus that. That's just misconception. I mean, think about it. We know so damn little about the world, and in particular, so damn little about the economy. Why not use every available tool that we have to try to understand it? It's not a question of some superiority or some hierarchy. That's just a misunderstanding of statistics. And I think that's where this idea of the randomized control trial as an ideal is a poison. It's a true poison that's poisoned the intellectual dialogue of economics, and I think in other areas as well, certainly in medicine. That's why I mentioned Horowitz was pushing back against it. The standard is always going to be, what have you done for me lately? What do I know? How have I advanced something? Not, you know, oh, did I do it in a methodologically correct way? I mean, that is just the sign of an insecure human being. We have these big problems. So, and you know, qualitative information is vital. I mean, it's really vital. People run these experiments. They don't have a clue about exactly what the context is in which they're placed. Then the total interpretation of the experiment changes. So I would just add that. The authors can talk about the book. I should, but on that, I've been writing a lot with Burton Singer about what's called abduction. It goes back to a philosophical idea of purse. It's one that many people know and talk about. But the idea is you try to come with the most compelling explanation for a phenomenon. And the most compelling doesn't mean I do it in some methodologically correct way or say, I'm going to put this in the framework of an RCT. I think actually, you want to think about it as, if an RCT will help you, fine, you run the RCT. But there are all other sources of evidence as well. And the crucial thing is, it's not just one trial, and it's not just one piece of evidence. The way a body of evidence gets assembled, it's not like running a trial and saying, aha, this is it. What you do is you put all these pieces together and then make an inference. And it's always conditional on what the data are. And it can always be revised. That's the nature of empirical knowledge.
Thank you. I'm so aware of the time that's running, and we're of course now weaving questions in between the presentations. But I really would still like the editors to quickly comment on this, I think, important issue that would come up very frequently in discussions.
Isabel, you want to start?
Maybe just a quick word about there was one participant who was mentioning the fact that nowadays none of RCT promoter would claim any kind of gold standard. I think here we should really make a difference between what they say, and it's true that many of them won't say this publicly, but we have to make a difference between what they say and what they do. And in many of the papers, they simply ignore any kind of results coming from any kind of other methods. And for me, this is one of the best proof of the attempt for and the neglect for other methods. And regarding the issue of controversy, I mean, initially this book was an attempt to launch a controversy. Many of them reject controversy, and this is very clear, and this book is an attempt, is an example of this. At the same time, we must admit that they listen and adapt, and this is a key argument of Tim Ogden chapters. The thing is that quite often, this adaptation means even more complex protocols. And as long as the bottom of the problem, which has to do with epistemology and the strong belief in the purity of the protocol, as long as this problem has not been resolved, I remain very pessimistic about their ability to really respond to criticism. And I would just add one point, the fact that this controversy is really needed and it's crucial given many kind of crowding out effects in terms of methods, crowding out effects in terms of human resources. How many talented young economists just go for RCT because it is the only way to find a job? Crowding out effects in terms of intervention. I mean, this is crucial. And this is particularly the case in the field of global health, for instance. And the chapter on global health in this book clearly show that the growing use of RCTs in the field of global health has been very detrimental in terms of the kind of intervention, because a number of initiatives are put in place not because they do good for the people, just because they can be analyzed through an RCT. And this is dramatic. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I really want to make sure our next two speakers have enough time. And as you can see, we will not have question and answer session afterwards. it will, of course, as you can see, be woven in between. I therefore do still want to have but a very quick answer from one of you, please. There is a question, an interesting question. How many, or did any of the authors of the book, who then looked through all the chapters and the arguments, did any of them modify their view about RCTs at any particular point? And it relates to something that Professor Heckman writes in his chapter, which is that the points made long ago, as he explained, over the history of RCTs are all valid today, but have largely been ignored. People have a missionary zeal, and at a time of systems orientation, it is quite problematic if we have missionary zeal about one particular methodology. Thomas Schwand also notes here that, as James points out, the controversy is often cast in methodological terms, but the issue is more how comfortable we are in dealing with uncertainty in our knowledge. So the question is the extent to which this missionary zeal can and perhaps have been tempered even in the writing of the book at a time when systems orientation and the uncertainty that we have to deal with is really going to demand completely different mindsets, ways of thinking about the work that we have to do. It's a big question, but any quick answer to that?
Well, I'll answer since nobody else will.
Please.
But I think you put your finger right on it. The world, people, there's this incredible desire for a fake certainty. To come in and say, here's my number, and I can show that to my donor, my foundation will be happy, I've produced this, my government will be happy. And the fact of the matter is that people do not want to live with the fundamental uncertainty that's out there in the world. And I think it's a tough task. And so a lot of charlatans can make a lot of progress by going out and promising certainty, which doesn't exist. And that's why I meant, that's what I meant by saying there was a lot learned and that that a lot was forgotten. And what's bizarre is the fact that, and dealing with uncertainty is really something that we don't teach economists to do as a group. We have put standard errors. Standard errors are the least of it. They are the least of the uncertainties surrounding a model. And creating this concept of robustness, it's a much more broad concept than that. And yet we try to teach people a certainty. The macro, it's not just people in RCTs, or somebody running a coefficient on education and an earnings equation. I'm talking about a lot of parts of economics are doing this, creating a kind of false certainty. And I think we should really cope with the fact that we know a lot less than we claim to. All the studies point that direction. We keep learning that. And I think we should somehow change the format of presentation. It's going to be unlikely for certain journals in the immediate future, that's for sure, because they're rib-rocked into this idea of a particular treatment effect, a standard error, and a particular way to do inference. And it's just not the way knowledge acquired.
Thank you very, very much. I'm going to move on to Ariane and Land, and I'm going to ask him to speak one after the other in order to make sure that we can then cover some questions after that. And it has been a real pleasure to have Ariane writing about ethics. There are already some questions about ethics for you to respond to afterwards, Ariane, who is a full professor at the Université Libre de Bruxelles in Belgium and co-director of the Center for European Research in Microfinance, PhD in mathematics, masters in philosophy. What can prepare one better for talking about randomized control trials? So over to you, Ariane.
Thank you, Zenda. Okay. Okay, here it is. Okay, great. So first of all, let me thank Zenda and the organizers of this webinar for inviting me and the publishers of the book who did an amazing job. My talk is about ethics of RCTs. It is based on the chapter of the book I wrote with Michel Abramovich, who is a cardiologist and was actively involved in medical RCTs. We consider the ethical issues of economic RCTs in the light of the extensive literature on ethics in medical studies. So first, what's the problem with the ethics of RCTs? The answer to that question is well summarized in the quotation from Baldassari and Abascal, who say that field experimenters play God, intervening in people's lives in consequential ways. According to this view, the main ethical concern should be do no harm. And this would impose clarifying the priorities between the RCT subjects and science. In medicine, the do not harm principle is taken very seriously. And since 1964, medical studies are constrained by global ethical rules, which are regularly updated. By contrast, in economics, ethics is not considered enough, and ethics committees are rather local than global. Another big issue concerns where RCTs take place. As Angus Deaton puts it, many experiments are organized in the tropics. Hoffman does even use the strong terms of colonial experimentation. Organizing RCTs in the global south is problematic for at least 3 reasons. First, the subjects are typically more vulnerable than in the north. Second, their informed consent is often missing. And last, the regulations on human experiments are less stringent than in high-income countries. The next problem relates to the usefulness of RCTs for economic policy. This is a general problem that goes beyond the ethical concerns, obviously, but it raises the question of whether the economic lessons from RCTs involving poor people are ultimately in their interest. And this point is also linked to James' point about the multiple outcomes, the side effects, and all these kind of considerations. Last but not least, an important risk associated with poor ethical rules is the reputation risk. The history of unethical medical studies shows that this is indeed a very serious concern. For example, in the 70s, a study on poor African American men left with untreated syphilis was stopped because of the intervention of the media. Speaking of lack of treatment for at least some participants, let us, some subject of the studies, let us now focus on a specific ethical requirement imposed on medical studies. This requirement is named Equipoise. According to its definition that dates back to the 80s, Equipoise means that the experimenters must have a genuine uncertainty regarding the comparative merits of each arm of the trial. In short, it means that the treated group and the control group should be considered on equal grounds. In practice, Equipoise is always imposed on medical studies. By contrast, many economists do not even know what Equipoise is. Typically, economic RCTs are disadvantaging the control group. For instance, the treated group received a treatment that is hopefully positive, while the control group gets just nothing. Let's take an example. Consider an RCT about the impact of having bail money on the justice system. In this case, the treated group receives the bail money and the control group receives nothing. So obviously, the control group is disadvantaged, which shows that equipoise is not met. This controversial situation was discussed on Twitter by Professor Stevenson and the Massachusetts Bail Fund. The fund objected that, and I wrote their quotation here, they objected that it's wrong to randomly pick some people to receive a life-saving treatment while sending some people to jail. And they even argue that it is racist to engage in this kind of research when you know racial disparities in our courts and jails are long-standing and stark. Then Professor Stevenson responded that although you think you know that your program is extremely effective, you really don't. Are you reaching the clients that need you the most, those who would suffer were it not for your help? This example, the conversation was much long, but this example shows that equipoise is not used on a regular basis in economic RCTs. But why is it so? If equipoise is so important, then why don't economists use it more often or even always? Well, until very recently, many economists did not even know what equipoise is, but apparently this is beginning to change. Reluctance toward equipoise can also be linked to the fact that funders of RCTs wish to see positive results, meaning that the treatment works well. Evidently, it's easier to obtain a positive result when you are dealing with a control group being already disadvantaged. In addition, equipoise can be costly to implement because experimenters must build and compare two options that are ex ante equally attractive. Of course, imposing equipoise would be easier with incentives, and in top medicine journals, there is typically a verification about whether equipoise is well applied, and this is a criteria for accepting papers in journals. But this is not the case in economics so far. In conclusion, there is still plenty of room for a serious conversation on the ethics of economic RCTs, and equipoise is surely a key piece of this conversation. As a matter of fact, the concept of equipoise is now mentioned here and there, but it is still far from being the norm. Among the promising avenues for progress, there is one. The first one is simply about learning from past mistakes and hearing criticism, of course. The second avenue relates to academic journals as guardians of ethical values. This is already the case in medicine. Third, the emergence of worldwide accepted principles, ethical principles, including equipoise, can possibly change the funder's mindset. And most importantly, economists become more and more aware of the reputation risk associated with experiments organized in the Global South and with vulnerable populations. In sum, I would say that there are grounds to be for being reasonably optimistic about ethical concerns. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Ariane. This has been very, very helpful. And certainly already there are several questions, and I would like to ask you, I think you can see the questions, right? Perhaps you can respond in typing to one or two of them while we move on to Lant, and we may come back to some of them if that is fine with you. I want to be sure that Lant presentation is reflected well, because I've been following his work for a very long time, and I always find it extremely pertinent, as are all the others, to what we are doing. Of course, as you know, Lant is the research director at the Oxford Blavatnik School of Government and the head of the director of the Research on Improving Systems of Education program. He's lived around the world, stood in practice, wrote more than 100 books, has more than 38,000 citations on a diversity of topics in development. And I certainly would like to acknowledge the importance also of his presentation. I do trust that we will have time for a few more responses after that for both Ariane and Lant. Over to you, Lant.
Sorry, I just want to focus on one big point. There are many, many things about this that can be said, and I've written lots of things about the various dimensions, but I want to make the one big point about this, which is the randomized control trial movement inside development is really about what development means, and is a part of a movement towards a very narrow and circumscribed, and I think not widely shared view of development. And only within that context can one even imagine that RCTs constitute more than a trivial part of the contribution. Development, I think, emerged historically as an understanding of a historical fourfold process of a country. And secondly, if you look at the indicators of human well-being, almost all of what matters for attaining high levels of almost all indicators of human well-being is national development. What's left over to be explained by the kinds of things that RCTs addressed are, in many cases, just trivial at best. And really, RCTs cannot be, and are really never meant to be much help with national development. So that's the big point I would like to make. There's two contrasting notions of what development is. The traditional, widely accepted notion of development that I think Southern governments share, that most development institutions share, had always been this kind of broader transformation, acquiring, that a country would produce an economy with higher productivity, a transformation of government towards one more representative to the needs and wishes of the citizens, a transformation of governance towards organizations in the public sector and in implementing policy that were more effective, and a transformation to a more fairer and equal treatment society generally. I think that was regarded as what development was about. That has been distorted by this kind of what I call kinky development, which is the imagination that one can draw some very low bar in some dimension of human well-being, like $a poverty, and then define development as being about promoting people getting just over that low bar. It happens in poverty, it happens in health, the focus on specific diseases or the absence of specific diseases, it happens in schooling. The Millennium Development Goal for schooling was completing primary school. No mention of learning, no mention for training that would actually lead to a productive human being that could contribute to their society and guide their family. So just super low bar goals. And I think this is a definition of development that appeals to kind of a narrow range of people working on it, like particular philanthropic foundations. And it's only kind of this second definition in which one can even imagine that tweaking the design of individual programs is really what matters to achieving human well-being. But that's an empirical question. The empirical question is, suppose we wanted to say how much of the variation across countries in an indicator of human well-being was associated with national development. The answer for poverty is all of it. There's a book called Poor Economics that has nothing to do with poverty and ignores the most basic fact about poverty. And the most basic fact about poverty is that if you look at what fraction of the variation in any measure of headcount poverty that the World Bank uses is associated with increases in the median income in the country. So the median person has higher or lower incomes in these countries. How much of that variation in the median accounts for the variation observed in the various kind of $1 a day, $2 a day standards of poverty? The answer is essentially all of it. The correlation between the median income in the country at a given time and its poverty rate is 0.99. You don't get 0.99 often from two measures of the same thing across countries. So basically, nothing's left to be explained by program design. And this makes a ton of sense. So, and by the way, the same thing is true in changes. If you look at what countries reduced poverty and what countries had poverty increased, it's all changes in the median income. So if you accomplish broad-based growth, you will get poverty reduction. It's a necessary and sufficient condition for achieving poverty reduction to have sustained increases or high levels of the average productivity in your economy. And the fact that none of these supposed interventions around poverty are even remotely tailored to or claim to be remotely tailored to the bigger questions of what leads countries to have highly productivity economies means they're not working on poverty. It's not that they're working on poverty in a good way or a bad way. They're not working on poverty. They've decided that they'd rather deploy a method than answer a big question, which is what leads economies to have higher or lower productivity. The same is true for other indicators. If you just take omnibus measures of human well-being that are constructed, and I use the social progress index because it was constructed by people who thought GDP was unimportant and wanted physical measures of human well-being. If you relate that to national development, which is measures of this fourfold transformation, essentially all of the variance, again, is accounted for by variations in national development. And in particular, there's just tons of white space, meaning no country has high social progress that has low national development, and no country with high national development has low measures of social progress. So again, it's just a necessary, sufficient condition. So, all of the attention to it is the way in which human well-being is going to be improved. And so anything that doesn't contribute to national development isn't really about development at all, in my mind. And, the same thing is a focus on method has biased the set of questions that we're asking. So oftentimes people say, oh, well, if you're against RCTs, how else would we answer these causal identification questions about programs? That's not the important question. The answer is if you're not working on what's going to really bring about the transformation, the transformative improvements that are needed to get people above even minimal thresholds, who cares about causal identification of the tiny little thing that you're off doing? You're not asking the right question at all. So, here are just differences across countries in kind of how students are performing at the same level of the kind of index of socioeconomic status of the household. And what you see is across countries at similar levels, like between Zambia and Vietnam, for students with the same measured household SES, you see 200-point differences because Vietnam has a fundamentally functional system of education and Zambia has a fundamentally dysfunctional system of education. And answering these questions is not amenable to the individualizable treatments that RCTs are amenable to. So you just can't power up to answer systemic questions, but those in fact are the important questions, and the kind of individualized treatment stuff just is missing, completely missing the point. So it's just, none of this, it really accounts for the observed differences across country over time or anything at the aggregate level. So, I don't know, it's just worse. As bad as Professor Heckman or others have might suggested that this fad has been, I think it's been even worse, because people who have worked in the evaluation community and development know that often you're aimed at very big, complex, systemic, transformative questions, and you're using instruments to try and provoke or lead to these bigger long-term changes. And this precisely is what just cannot be measured effectively. But what the RCT revolution is doing is buffaloing people away from focusing on big, imponderable, hard to answer questions towards these narrow, tailored interventions where you can point and say, I financed that, that led to this, wahoo, aren't I a terrific person? And so I think it's just been a terrible, terrible, it's been worse than useless in promoting the true sense of development that matters for human well-being. That's what I was going to say.
I thank you very much, Lant. That was, again, a very thoughtful and important contribution. And it's reflected also in both Ariane and your case by questions coming up. Clearly, we will not have time to respond to many of them. There are also comments, questions for clarity, questions that propose alternatives. What we will do, as we said, is we will list them and get some of you to respond to them. And we will put that up for all of your public consumption. Perhaps we can twist one of the, or a few of the authors' arms also for some fireside chats that go deeper into some of these very important issues. I want to throw out 3 questions. There are 3 minutes left. It may be completely impossible. Let's see if we can get 1 or 2 responses to that. The first one that I want to raise is the book seems to reflect a majority of, if not nearly all, Western authors. And one would wonder, where is the space for alternative knowledge systems and indigenous researchers and evaluators who have written extensively about issues that relate to this? So if somebody can just give a quick perspective on that, that would be excellent. That's one question. The second question, do these debates on RCTs not raise the question of models of behavior and theories of change? And how do authors view that? And then a third question is posed, if I can just quickly find it among all of these, by Osvaldo Feinstein, who mentioned that, and it is rather among all the long lists that I have here, not so easy to find. He asked, to put all the pieces together, can Judea-Pulse data fusion methodology be useful for integrating diverse sources of data, including RCTs? And it then relates to how do RCTs fit into the broader landscape of methodology and vice versa. Anybody who wants to respond to any of these 3, and we will then close after that.
Sorry, I would like to respond to 2 of those. One of the nice features of this book is it does end with interviews of 2 actual people who've been deeply engaged in policy making in India from both the kind of macro and micro perspectives, to precisely elicit the views of people in India that have been working on the ground to thwart the usefulness of the RCTs that have been mostly, again, the RCT movement is almost entirely Western academics as well. So this isn't a Western versus non-Western issue. But the practitioner's response is, meh, this really hasn't been a big deal. It had, in spite of all of the studies that have been done on India and about India, it just doesn't add up to anything compelling on the questions that policymakers need to answer because they're not well adapted to answering those questions. So I think the inclusion of actual policymaker interviews to relate their relationship to this kind of thing, I think it's, you know, it's very clear that around the set of questions they need to answer, as Professor Heckman would say, these are deep, hard, complex questions that you have to be answered in the face of large uncertainty in the individual things. Sorry, I was gonna, what was the last? Oh, the data fusion. The problem with data fusion is the RCTs aren't, I have a blog post people can look for called the Pritchett test. They're not generating anything that's interesting or usable about the larger questions. By focusing on these, I say, look, if something were going to be relevant to answering a question of does this or does this not promote economic growth, it kind of, to be plausible, had to meet certain criteria. And most of what's amenable to the individualized treatment that allows you to power up an RCT aren't systemic questions that have any credibility of being or need to be fused into a theory of growth. You're just not looking at variation of the type that's interesting over time, across countries, et cetera, that even conceivably could be relevant. So there's nothing to fuse from this about these big questions.
So maybe to complement from the editor's point of view, why no Southern voice in the book? I think that there are trivial reasons. When we launched our call, there was no answer from the South. And we didn't have at the time enough connection in this field because it was not our field of specialization to try to catch and identify some important voice from the South. Now we know better. For example, we could have invited Naila Kabir or others. As mentioned by Lent, there is these interviews at the end of the book, and in particular, these two interviews from high-ranking policymaker in India, which are very interesting. I think that if we organize another session, it would be great to invite them. But I think that it's one of the main weaknesses of our book, and maybe a suggestion would to publish a response or a book. And there is already some initiative on this. For example, in Africa, there is a Codestria special issue about RCTs. And from our part, two possibilities. One already on track, which is some launching events in the Global South. We are already planning at the beginning of the year in Sub-Saharan Africa, in India, in Peru and Brazil, and maybe in a second edition of the book, it could be an idea. And just one point on the data fusion, I think that methodology would have a positive answer. We term it another way, but with the same meaning. We call that MMA, not for mixed martial arts, but for mixed method approaches, and which is really combat sports, given the hubris of the RCT proponent. And to finish with my intervention, I would like you, I was very surprised with the difference between the past appraisal of RCT through the poll, which was quite nuanced, and the relatively very positive answer on in time of COVID. 44% of the audience think that it can contribute really in this time of poverty. I think that you should think about this point. We've got the biggest shock on poverty, which RCT has been praised through the Nobel Prize. What can be and what has been the policy, I mean, not in the health sector, but economic and social policy, which are already conducted in the field today, which have been driven, which has been inspired by RCT in the last 20 years, and what could be these RCT experiments useful for the polity to come, even when COVID will be over. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think what this discussion has highlighted and the presentations is that there are so many different issues that we can still and should still discuss. I just look at the comments and the questions that I hope we will address afterwards. It's rich in thinking. And then we did not have sufficient alternative perspectives. Also, I think in general, there was quite a lot of critique of RCTs, and the debates that we've had in the past have been fairly acrimonious between different sides of passionate persons. And an excellent place to end, I think, is exactly as you've just done, Francois. Look to the future. What it means for what we all face now. As I said in the beginning, evaluation now has to be the best it can be, because humanity and its natural ecosystems have never been confronted with these kind of crises that are now multiplying and also accelerating one another. Perhaps with some glimmers of hope of also deceleration somewhere possible. So evaluation needs to help to build on this and contribute to this. Otherwise, it's not worthwhile for what it is intended to do. And so what would be for me a good note to end is to say, first of all, thank you very much to all of you for the contribution you've made. I trust people will read the book, the pros, the cons, because you discuss the strengths and the weaknesses. But then also that we make an effort to bring development economists, auditors, policy specialists, evaluators, researchers, everybody who works in the field of evaluation from many different perspectives, that we bring all of these together in ways that work to bridge our differences between our disciplines and fields of work and philosophies and knowledge systems. Not to become the same, but to draw the best and also to work in create synergies between them so that we can really use the best solution, the best methodology, the best way of thinking, the best combination of knowledge systems, the best combination of methodologies to help resolve the issues that we are confronted with now and into the future. Is exactly as Lund pointed out, the big issues that need to be resolved need different ways of thinking to what we've all done up to now. And we really need to emphasize the richness that's locked up in all the different methodologies, disciplines, ideologies, and work together to resolve and to address and respond to the issues of the day. Let's work together towards that. Thank you again also to Daniel and Lana for making this technically possible. For all of you who have listened, we will be in touch again with more responses to your comments and questions. We will list them all and maybe add some additional ones that we would like you to think through. And with that, I have to conclude, despite the fact that there is so much more that we can discuss. I hope you will buy the book. Thank you, everybody, for your attention. Goodbye.